I would like to welcome Italki as the first sponsor of Death of a Game. Italki is a language learning website that connects you to real-life language teachers. It's kind of like having a language tutor and a teacher for as low as like $5 an hour. Someone who can help you with conversations for the language that you want to learn. If you use my affiliate link, I get a kickback whenever you sign up for a class. I'm currently brushing up on my Spanish, so feel free to come join me on my journey. Vieni a emprender un idioma conmigo en Italki. The Avengers, a truly iconic comic book series published by Marvel Comics, written by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby back in 1963. Now in 2020, 57 years later, the Avengers have not only become a hit comic book series with dozens of issues, but that success would pale in comparison to what came in 2012. Marvel would truly capitalize on the Avengers series in 2012 with a smash hit movie grossing $1.5 billion. Marvel Studios and their distributor Walt Disney Pictures would launch 3 more Avengers titles, with the most recent one being Avengers Endgame, which is currently the highest grossing movie ever at $2.7 billion. When an IP like the Avengers starts breaking worldwide records, usually what follows is clothing, toys, merchandise, and for the topic of this video in particular, video games. Now, Marvel is no stranger to the world of video games, having a slew of titles over the course of many years, with highlights being the fan-favorite fighting game franchise Marvel vs. Capcom, the co-op action game series Marvel Ultimate Alliance, and finally the less successful, as it was featured unfortunately on this series as well, but beloved nonetheless, always online title, Marvel Heroes. But Marvel was planning their highest profile video game yet, something that would put those previous great superhero adaptation games in the past. Marvel Avengers, as it was dubbed, developed by Crystal Dynamics and published by Square Enix, was set to be an action RPG game, with a roster complete of, well, the Avengers, except Hawkeye. The cast of characters and a well-known IP alone were enough to get people interested in what Marvel Avengers was to be. Marvel Avengers launched the fall of 2020 but failed to captivate the masses as intended, and keep a consistent player base, losing over 96% of players months after launch. With no holy patch or reboot seemingly in the tuck for Crystal Dynamics and publisher Square Enix, and a near insurmountable amount of problems to overcome, it seems that Thanos might not be the only one dictating fate today. What were the largest reasons for the failure of Marvel Avengers, which was set to soar to superhero levels? And why does a title merely months after launch find itself featured on this series? In this episode of Death of a Game, we grab our budget costumes and capes and take to the skies, portals, or whichever method of travel you prefer, to tell the tale of Marvel Avengers, the universe where Thanos seemingly won. The story begins in the hands of a studio, Crystal Dynamics, under the powerful wing of an iconic publisher, Square Enix. Crystal Dynamics, founded in Redwood City, California in 1992, is the video game studio behind the iconic Tomb Raider series, the Legacy of Kain series, and a personal favorite of mine, Gex. Fast forward nearly 2 decades and we saw the resurgence of Crystal Dynamics under the Square Enix guidance and coffers, and the rebirth of the beloved Tomb Raider franchise to great success. Where Crystal Dynamics and Marvel begin their relationship starts from the announcement from Square Enix, announcing a multi-gaming partnership with iconic superhero brand Marvel. Crystal Dynamics wasn't just working on an untitled Avengers project either, more Marvel-themed games were planned as well. January 26, 2017, and we see the first public announcement concerning the Avengers project, as it was being dubbed. The Avengers project was being developed by Crystal Dynamics in conjunction with Deus Ex developer Eidos Montreal. Details were relatively vague, but the game would feature an original story and offer a universe that gamers could play in for years to come, which implies it was an online game at least. More details surrounding the project were promised at E3 2018, which was a year and a half later. While the newly announced Spider-Man game by Insomniac Games stole the show, hard to be mad at a delay or lack of information for a mystery project when you have the Marvel franchise looking as good as it did with Spider-Man games. I think they were probably excused. The Avengers project would go dark for another year, finally showcasing in a grand reveal at E3 2019. We knew the game would feature the namesake, of course, and the action combat that would entail, but what about the genre of the game? Was it online or single player? Or maybe both? The Avengers project was leaked at an E3 Coliseum panel for allowing up to 4 players multiplayer online, which was not unlike the previous Marvel game Ultimate Alliance. The Avengers project would feature a unique single-player storyline starring each of the Avengers, well, besides Hawkeye for some reason. Now officially dubbed Marvel Avengers, many details were revealed concerning the game, but none of that really mattered when all you could see was, well, these. Apparently they looked this way because Crystal Dynamics said they never considered using the likeness of the actors from the MCU movies. Which, sorry to say, I just don't buy. It's more likely they were expensive rights and they didn't have the cheddar or want to spend it. But this is as transparent of a wound as possible already so early in the video. That's because the entire aspect of superheroes and their star power outside of their given realm is likeness. You recognize them for how they look. When the movie characters of late pretty much dominate the box offices and people's minds concerning how Avenger characters are supposed to look, when you have my Mexican-American dad as Iron Man, a homeless Thor, Captain America pre-serum, Mara Jade Widow, and for some reason the elusive man from Mass Effect, well, it's quite easy to see why these would be immediately parodied and not taken seriously. Likeness for some superhero comic fans is one of the most important aspects of the game, so out of the gate missing the mark there would be a critical error. Likeness error or not, it helped that Crystal Dynamics got some of the best VO talent from the video game anime scene, with Nolan North as Tony Stark, Troy Baker as Bruce Banner, Jeff Shine as Captain America, Travis Willingham as Thor, and finally Laura Bailey as Black Widow. Marvel Avengers was set to launch May 15th, 2020. The lead combat designer on Marvel Avengers told IGN that although the game had microtransactions, there was nothing that affected gameplay and no loot boxes. This would mean their primary mode of monetizing would likely be costumes, but to counteract the negative aspect of this, the future characters added to the ever-growing online game would be free DLC, which is a notion that should be celebrated. When you have blockbuster-style video games such as Marvel Avengers, or at least what it was intending to be, you have the fear of the game focusing too much on how things look versus how they play. To complement this line of thinking, you might extend this line of thinking to, well, quick-time events, which are often present in cinematic-style video games. Rest assured, according to Square Enix, quick-time events or QTEs wouldn't be a core aspect of gameplay in Marvel Avengers. Crystal Dynamics announced near the end of June 2019 a new studio, Crystal Northwest, stationed in Bellevue, Washington, focused on Marvel Avengers specifically. All of these announcements seemed quite exciting. With split development initially, perhaps it was indeed better for them to centralize their focus from just one studio with Marvel Avengers. However, even through the release of all of this information, I couldn't help but find myself still wondering, where was the gameplay? What had been shown so far was rendered gameplay which could be doctored and not quite indicative of real gameplay. With a launch set in under a year, the lack of gameplay was a bit alarming. The Marvel marketing and merchandise machine wouldn't wait for any gameplay. They already had 2 prequel novels penned and announced by January of 2020. One an actual prequel novel and the other an art book. Within a few more weeks, a delay was announced, citing reasons of needing to adjust and polish the game. So now if the alarm bells aren't going off, let's sound them ourselves. Delays aren't the end of the world, but delays cooped with very little details and footage shown usually means an unfinished game. Still, this didn't stop Square Enix from preparing pre-order bonuses to entice people to pre-purchase the game. The same month, the popular toy brand Funko Pop would announce a Marvel Avengers line of toys, which I personally think are actually kind of quality. But that's kind of beside the point. Marvel Avengers, before it had any proof in the pudding of what the game was supposed to be or even kind of what it looked like, was finding ways to monetize in other avenues through their publisher Square Enix and the Marvel license. It was feeling less like a video game project and more like a licensing deal. At this point, it seemed like the marketing and merchandise teams behind the game must have been bigger than the development teams. Like all things with Square Enix, when they do a bad, they also do a good. They would announce June 23rd, 2020 that Marvel Avengers would allow for a free upgrade on the next generation consoles, PS5 and Xbox Series X. Meanwhile, the same day they announced yet another Marvel Avengers themed product, this time a prequel comic detailing Marvel's road to A-Day. The game had some serious high expectations now. I don't think I've ever seen so many prequel novels and comics dedicated to a game with so little to show for so far. Whatever was happening behind the scenes concerning Marvel Avengers was possibly reflective of the overall lack of progress publicly shown. If you have something to show and you're proud about it, you're probably going to show it off. August 2020, Marvel Avengers would host a slew of weekend betas for all launch platforms except for Google Stadia. The beta consisted of some of the hero missions featured in the game, co-op Warzone and Drop Zone missions, harm challenge rooms, and hero plus world progression systems allowing you to level up to level 15 and power level 45. Hero missions were essentially the main campaign and restricted to single players only. Previously, Marvel action games allowed for cooperative play through the main campaign, so this was kind of a downgrade. Warzone missions consisted of the majority of the multiplayer play, which are missions that featured 5 different types featured in an open area that players can explore. Drop Zone missions were a quick one-objective mission made to grind out experience and resources. Now, I'm already getting slight Anthem vibes here, and maybe it's just because we just covered it, but with these aforementioned missions, none of them sounded significant enough to tide players over, especially an online player base. Relying on people wanting to replay the same content is usually a problematic endeavor when the combat isn't necessarily better or more unique than any competitors in the space, and doesn't feature any PvP content, which could break monotony and predictability. Marvel Avengers needed Jedi Academy level gameplay and multiplayer modes to crush on combat alone in my eyes, which right out of the gate puts Marvel Avengers in a hole where they have to keep putting out more and more expensive and time-consuming content to satisfy the ever wave of Marvel gamers. The solution to such demand is, well, you kind of have to meet the supply, right? If Marvel Avengers didn't have enough content to last at launch, it could face the much same fate that Anthem did on the Death of a Game series. It's surprisingly difficult to create content meant to be repeated over and over again, and not have people get completely bored of it, whether through variety in modes, difficulty levels, or different ways of playing through them. The dangers of relying on repetitive content is they are usually blatantly designed as such, so the player is able to determine when a developer wants them to repeat something over and over again, and they're not necessarily joyous to do such. Marvel Avengers would launch September 4th, 2020, and according to aggregate review website Metacritic, would score a 68 out of 100 from 21 different critics, scoring much worse with the user base. The Steam launch wouldn't fare much better, scoring a 65% positive score, resulting in a mixed overall status. Game Informer felt strong about the title in their review, granting it an 8.75 out of 10. They waxed poetic about the gameplay, the visuals, and well, honestly, everything in the game. The only thing remotely negative mentioned in their review is sort of glossed over entirely. This is more serious than mentioned, as Marvel Avengers was designed to release its story and multiplayer content over the course of years. It already so early on in the launch cycle, players were wondering, well, where's the rest of the content? It doesn't help when outlets like Game Informer are seemingly ignorant to these issues, and frankly speaking, seeming a bit too excited about the game. IGN ends up being the voice of reason here, scoring the game a 6 out of 10. IGN was fair in mentioning the very obvious positives of Marvel Avengers, such as the fun and endearing campaign featuring Kamala Khan, or the bendy Miss Marvel and her origin story. This is eerily similar to the Anthem Death of a Game, an endgame revolving around repetitive, unimaginative mission structures and a poor loot system to complement such. The difference is here, however, where, well, Marvel Avengers had a compelling single-player experience, but the problem with the single-player experience is that it was greatly flawed in 2 ways. The first being, well, it only lasted 10 to 15 hours, which isn't really worth the price of full admission. The second large issue is slightly more debatable, but an often cited negative from both critics and players alike. That's concerning Kamala. Now, I'm all for more female protagonist representation in video games, as they are categorically less common and not represented properly, but the issue in Marvel Avengers concerning Kamala is, well, Ms. Marvel is an unknown character essentially, sharing the same party of the freaking Avengers. It's natural she's going to be overshadowed, and not fair that developers designed the first 3 to 4 hours of the game solely consisting of playing this new character. I think it was possible to introduce a character like Ms. Marvel and do it well even, but perhaps not giving the players the ability to jump right into their favorite superheroes could have created an inherent bias against Ms. Marvel and her surprisingly quality storyline. Crystal Dynamics is no stranger to a lead female protagonist, which could have influenced their desire to have one for Marvel Avengers, going with what they know and all. But Marvel fans can be a bit ruthless about stuff like this, and perhaps it would have been better to try to mitigate that to some extent. Since we've talked about the story in Marvel Avengers, we should talk about the gameplay. The gameplay in Marvel Avengers, in my opinion, is the ultimate smoke and mirrors. It looks incredible. I mean, seriously, the visuals, the animations, you name it, it's a gorgeous looking game, especially when people are in motion. But where the illusion part comes into play is, although the game purports to be an action RPG with a skill tree system, the skill tree customization options are limited at best, and the majority of the gameplay consists of light and heavy attacks, which is kind of more of a brawler than an action RPG. Attacks feel a bit clunky as you realize that aiming is done kind of liberally in the game. My main takeaway with Marvel Avengers is that the game plays more like an action brawler than an actual action RPG. The issue is that it needs to be the latter for it to work in the way that Crystal Dynamics designed, and that was going to be hard to circumvent when a strong amount of the gameplay present in Marvel Avengers, and I say gameplay loosely, was QuickTime events. Yep, the QuickTime events that were promised not to dominate the gameplay dominated the gameplay. In big iconic sequences in the game, it takes a mere push of a button to defuse things. Sometimes not even pushing the button doesn't result in a failstate being triggered. It's like superheroes with Nerf swords. Even if you disabled QTEs and the options, they still permeated a large amount of the single player content, which was the best content currently offered in Marvel Avengers. What was Marvel Avengers trying to be? Well, games as a service is clearly one of those aspects with the promise of a steady trickle of future content. But besides its way of monetizing and its larger-than-life superheroes, what was Marvel Avengers trying to be as a game? Much like Anthem, another games as a service featured on this series, it seemed to want to mimic aspects of a popular loot shooter Destiny 2, all the while failing to realize what fully made Destiny 2 what Destiny 2 is. The skill and inventory are eerily similar to Destiny 2, like that's not a coincidence. It seems a slew of high-profile titles seeking to capitalize on the market of looter shooters dominated by Destiny 2, The Division, and before the angry fans in the comments get mad at me, Warframe. If you can't get your loot system properly functioning and provide enough challenging in-game content to keep people engaged, it doesn't matter how many elements of a looter shooter you have, when you're missing the very core of what makes them what they are. In just 1 month, the article headline reads, "Marvel Avengers player base is dwindling, but Crystal Dynamics promises new content." The cat was out of the bag already, which means there was no time or chances to mitigate any of the blowback. That means the player base could have had a sharp drop to see developers come out so quickly and so matter of fact. Crystal Dynamics promised to introduce a new hub zone for future missions, more challenging missions in the way of aims, cloning labs, and a number of bug fixes. We will continue to add new content to the game in the coming months as we address issues in overall game balance, including loot distribution and quality of life features everyone is clamoring for to improve our day-to-day experience, from accessibility to co-op communication tools to balancing the economy. Dwindling player base or not, Marvel Avengers still was the best-selling game in the US in October 2020. That meant that Square Enix potentially wouldn't just drop support. I think the Washington Post said it best. Clearly the studio behind the game was dedicated and open to feedback and willing to work hard. Or crunch, more like it. But these qualities are all great to have, to be able to go back to the drawing board and work on a title. But with online titles, you don't always have the time to do such a thing. And when development was split at launch and as expensive as Marvel Avengers was, you don't have time to keep spinning the wheels. It's time to put up or shut up according to those in charge. Surely at this point, it had to have gotten the higher-ups interested in the progress, considering Square Enix lost $63 million following the Marvel Avengers launch. It's not very often we see quite the high-profile failure so publicly documented with some population data to boot. By November 17, 2020, a mere 2 months after launch, Marvel Avengers player base had shrunk a whopping 96%. According to Steam charts, they went from a peak of 28,145 players to 1,887 by November. Without enough revenue being generated by those buying the game and those who continue to play the game and purchase costumes and the like, Crystal Dynamics wasn't likely going to get the opportunity to create the content they needed to get them out of the hole. This is the danger of failing so large, from expectations so large. When hype is at an all-time high, a hype you did your best to cultivate by the way, the game has to knock it out of the park. The amount of money pumped into Marvel Avengers was multiple dozens of millions, which means it needed to wow fans, not just tickle their fancy a little bit or their wallets. That's a mere weeks ago as of typing and voicing this. So why did I feature Marvel Avengers on the Death of a Game series when the developers haven't announced shuttering it? Well, coming off my Anthem video recently, it's impossible not to see some of the exact same signs here regarding Marvel Avengers. A high-profile game that was supposed to change the industry to an extent, coming out with some of the most gorgeous visuals and animations we've seen, with subpar features and a lackluster in-game content, and an unfortunately short shelf life. While some watching will inevitably think to compare Marvel Avengers to No Man's Sky, saying that even on the brink of defeat after overpromising so much, you can still bring a game back. But these aren't really fair comparisons. No Man's Sky had the core gameplay already figured out. It was lacking promised features. Marvel Avengers never really promised anything outright, other than an iconic superhero experience to be experienced for years. Well, people got bored of it in weeks, and the gameplay isn't nearly as reflective of what was promised compared to No Man's Sky. They could do another 3 campaigns worth of content for Marvel Avengers, and it's not going to be enough to keep players interested, which is not a problem No Man's Sky has. Simply put, I don't see a grandiose comeback planned for Marvel Avengers. It seems like the content required to breathe life back into the game is too time-consuming and expensive to make, and that then begs the question, do people even really want to play that? Considering they are playing as arguably budget-looking superhero character versions of the Avengers, and the gameplay isn't any deeper than the previous Marvel action games, that doesn't seem to be the case. But only time can truly tell if Crystal Dynamics takes the BioWare Anthem trickle approach of promising changes and having very little to show a year later, or CD straight decides to axe the game. With no prophetic save-the-day patch in hand, would slow and steady work in the case of the expensive Marvel Avengers at this point? It's that time of the video, detectives, and sometimes it comes earlier than usual even, which mimics the lifespan of a certain title we're covering today. Hopefully you've been acquiring the clues along the way so we can compile our evidence concerning the largest contributing factors in the failure of Marvel Avengers. Marvel level expectations and failing to satisfy them. The gameplay lacks depth and looks better than it actually plays. Lacking in diverse and challenging multiplayer content with a repetitive endgame. RPG and loot aspects seem at best tacked on and below market standards. Simply a bad value for your dollar. The last point really rings true for those who have played Ultimate Alliance or Marvel vs. Capcom. To others, you might be thinking that Marvel only does video games to make cheap money-making flips, like some other famous IPs do sometimes. To us fans of the aforementioned games though, we know that video game developers are capable of much more concerning the Marvel franchise. The idea that a Marvel game could actually rival something like Destiny 2 is a great idea, and I can echo the sentiments of wanting such a thing. But you don't just start out performing a game that has over 10 years of combined development / live work since its previous launch, that was developed by some of the most talented developers in the space, and has won a slew of awards. The story of Marvel Avengers is still developing, and I'm sure details will be revealed concerning the development that explain why the game launched in the state that it did. But this is likely the end of this detective covering it all, unless they make a Tony Stark level comeback. And well, they have the character cast for it. Thanks for watching, guys.
We've noticed your valor on the home front, soldier.